Welcome everyone for this first inaugural lecture in uh, the lecture series, which is being conducted by the History Society in AUD. And what better day than Constitution Day to start this, as Professor Bodh Prakash put it. And Before we start with this lecture, I'd like to ask our student Pratap Chandra Sen to give us some details and introduce us to the History Society itself. So, welcome, Pratap.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being present today. And welcome to the History Society's first official lecture, part of a special series of lectures celebrating 75 years of India's independence. The History Society was conceived as an attempt to enrich Ambedkar University's extracurricular experience by providing students with the opportunity to engage with a wide variety of historical topics through lectures, heritage walks, and the preparation of academic research papers with the help of the faculty members. With college being relegated to the online medium, the premise of the History Society has assumed even greater importance, not just to enhance the study of history, but to ensure that students can meet other like minded individuals part of this field both online and offline. We hope that the people present here today will be present in the upcoming lectures in the coming week, part of this series. I would now like to ask Tanuja ma'am to please introduce the speaker and moderator for this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratap. Our speaker and moderator do hardly need an introduction in this university. Uh, I'd like to begin with Professor Bodh Prakash. They're very closely, both of them, interested and invested in the topic of today's lecture, which is nationalism and its relationship to language, particularly Urdu poetry, as the title is. Uh, uh, Professor Bodh Prakash is also the dean of undergraduate studies, and he's a professor in the School of Letters at AUD. He has been deeply interested in literature around partition, which has been the mainstay of his research. Though he has written widely about literatures in Indian languages in multiple articles that he has published. His work on aesthetics and ideology in Hindi and Urdu literature is widely read, and it's a very, very important work in the series in literature around like looking at how poetry conceptualized and how within that the sentiments of the various people who were looking at their freedom struggle were presented. Professor Salil Mishra he is a member of our history faculty. He has most students here know him because he has taught widely both at the undergraduate and master's level. His research interest is also centered around partition, communalism, language. His work is has his current research is around Hindi language in terms of its emergence and the kinds of debates that emerge in the 20th century around Hindi language. He has written extensively around communalism and partition, particularly in the 20th century, 1930s and 40s, primarily around Uttar Pradesh. He teaches. He teaches courses around nationalism, communalism, partition to students, writes widely in academic journals and books, as well as in the popular press, and is a very, very widely read author in that realm. So both these speakers are deeply interested in the not just the aesthetics, but the way in which Hindi and Urdu poetry developed and the kinds of debates and discussions that took place around these languages and how the idea of nationalism and patriotism emerged in these debates. So I welcome both Professor Mishra and Professor Bodh Prakash to this lecture, and I hand it over to Professor Bodh Prakash to moderate this session. So, welcome both of you, and over to you both.
Thank you, Tanuja, for that kind introduction. Uh, I must begin by actually congratulating Yogesh for initiating this series as part of the first sort of initiative of the History Society, which has recently been formed within the School of Undergraduate Studies. I think it's a very welcome initiative, and I think we need to congratulate Yogesh and the history faculty for initiating this. Particularly, as Pratap said, in these times of COVID restrictions, we hardly get to meet each other in person. It has become all the more important to create these platforms where an exchange of ideas, exchange of ideas of these kinds are possible. The topic for today is nationalism and patriotism in the 20th century, reflections on Urdu poetry. Both nationalism and patriotism being terms which are extremely relevant, currently used in a variety of ways. Though, of course, I understand that Salil will be talking more about the 20th century rather than the 21st. But I hope that some kind of some kind of context can also be provided for our own times today. This is, of course, the fact that we are doing this as we celebrate 75 years of Indian independence is again very, very significant, because the whole idea of a nation emerges from a certain context. It emerges from a certain anti-colonial context. I'm sure Salil will have much more to say about this. So without any further ado, I will request Salil to make his presentation first, and then we can have a discussion, questions, discussion, comments, whatever we have. Salil, thank you. Please come.
Thank you both, Tanuja, Yogesh, friends, colleagues, students. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My talk today is actually not meant for Urdu people who are rooted in Urdu. It is a kind of view on Urdu from the outside. Out of the two elements, two components of the talk, nationalism and patriotism and Urdu poetry, I will not explain nationalism and patriotism very much. Sorry, both, or even their differences, similarities. It was Yogesh's idea anyway. So if you people have a question, if you want to question how nationalism is different from patriotism, Yogesh will have to answer it. I will not talk about it today.
We will certainly raise the question.
But so that will be for yoga. But I will spend some time discussing the other thing, Urdu, and I will introduce Urdu to you. And I'm assuming, I have to assume, if I have to say something on it, I'm assuming that you are ignorant about Urdu and very curious. So ignorance and curiosity, those are the two preconditions for me to start, because I want to look at Urdu completely from an independent outside vantage point. And I had told Yogesh that I may end up taking about 50-55 minutes, but I'll try and wind up early. I have a story to tell today, but my story has been framed in the form of a riddle. I have a riddle, I have a question. I will state the question and then I will try and answer it. The riddle is as follows. I am saying that Urdu was a most unlikely candidate for generating patriotic poetry, but it did. It did plenty of it. How did that happen? So there is a riddle, there is a question, and I will provide, I will have a narrative, I'll have a story in which I will provide the answer. I want to present Urdu as an atypical, unusual, and a sociologically interesting literary tradition. People in North India take Urdu so much for granted because they have been brought up in it. So either they take Urdu for granted or they have a very stereotypical notion of Urdu, either being a Muslim language or a feudal language or a combination of both. Because of these reasons, that Urdu's idiosyncrasies and Urdu's distinctiveness tend not to be noticed by those who are brought up in that tradition. You have to be outside it in some ways. So my story of Urdu is as follows. I'll spend half my lecture talking about Urdu and the other half talking about patriotism and nationalism in Urdu poetry. Here is the story. During medieval times, particularly under the Mughals, Persian came to acquire a literary and administrative prestige. In Iran, the homeland of Persian, the poets and men of letters had begun to be persecuted, particularly under the Safavid dynasty. Many of them ran from there and they migrated to India. India then had the image of being a Darul Aman, or a land of peace. India was seen as a place where poets, men of letters, these important people would be respected and patronized. And as a result of that, Persian came to be established in India as a language of prestige, both literary and administrative. But it was, after all, it was an alien language. It was an alien tradition, much like French was in Russia in the 19th century. The elite spoke that language. It had the prestige, but no connectivity with common people. Around the 18th century, there developed, particularly in the north, a new poetry, which is, I'm refraining from calling it Urdu, but I mean Urdu, which this new poetry, new poetic tradition, it was, at one level, it was a complete replication of Persian, of all its forms, all that Persian was all about. This new poetry tended to replicate that. So there was ghazal, romantic conversation. There was qasida, panegyric praise of the kings and others. There was marsia, elegies, the wailing at the Battle of Karbala. So it was a very Islamic thing, very Shia particularly. So those were the tropes of this new poetry, and they all came from Persian. But all this was expressed in a language, in a style that was, which was in circulation in North India. So all this was spoken in a language which was in circulation in North India, or rather Midland. That would be a better expression. Present days, parts of Punjab, Haryana, UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, this had a general name, Midland, and there was plenty of connectivity, plenty of movement to and fro. So this new poetry picked up all the expressions from Persian, but it used them in an expression which belonged to the Midland. So the new literature, new poetry, it had a kind of Persian connectivity. Farsi was the feeder language, but it also had a local rootedness. So Persian connectivity, local rootedness were two features of this new poetry that developed primarily in Delhi around the beginning of the 18th century. Now, this language was known by many names. It had many names. The longest name, of course, was Zaban-e-Urdu Mualla Shahjahanabad, meaning thereby the language of the exalted Mualla, exalted gentry of Shahjahanabad. Often it would be used as Zaban-e-Urdu. Often it would be used as Urdu-e-Mualla. Eventually, in the 18th century, it settled for the shortest possible, Urdu. Urdu is a Turkish word for camp, for lashkar. Often it was also known as Hindi. So there are places where Urdu was known as Hindi. It had a new name. Throughout its life, since the 18th century till the 20th century, this Urdu kept oscillating between Persianization and a kind of indigenization. So sometimes it would be very heavily Persianized, then it would become somewhat indigenized, and then would get Persianized again. But the two elements, the local rootedness and a Persian connectivity, were very central to this poetry, and they were not given up. Their exact proportion changed, sometimes more Persianized, sometimes less Persianized. So there is no clear, distinct pattern or trajectory. There is a kind of oscillation to and fro. Now, at some point, ghazal became the most dominant expression of this poet. So much so that the two words, Urdu and ghazal, have actually become synonymous in popular imagination. It is often not realized that ghazal can be written in any other language. It is just a style, it's a genre, and that there is lots more to Urdu than ghazal. So much has been written in Urdu, which is actually not ghazal. This is not an idea which is easily digested. The two are treated as synonymous. The two are treated as mutually substitutable terms, Urdu and ghazal. Ghazal has really become the template for Urdu poetry. Now, this is important for my story, this point, so I want your attention. Now, ghazal again is an extremely unusual and a typical genre, typical style. It is an Arabic word. It means conversations with the lover. This ghazal, a ghazal, will consist of a number of couplets, sher, two-liners, and each couplet, each sher should be complete with its meanings, its punchlines, its climax. It should begin, your story should begin with the first line and should be over by the second line. So two-liners should be complete. They come complete with their own meanings. The meanings ideally should not spill over to the next couplet, the next sher, which will carry its own independent meaning. So within a ghazal, if there are 10 couplets, each couplet is supposed to tell you a story. It is supposed to stand for something. It is independent, unconnected with the rest. Each sher, each couplet is a universe in itself. Ghazal merely is a repository of these independent meaning carriers, meaning carrying two-liners. Some European commentator called ghazal an oriental pearl unstrung together. All the pieces are together, but they are unstrung. They are connected to each other only in form, line, scale, rhyming structure, but not by meaning. So to take, if one ghazal, one sher in a ghazal ends at hota, ye na thi hamari qismat ki wisale yaar hota, then you know all the shares of the ghazal will end similarly. Yaar hota, Badakhar hota, Mazar hota, Zar hota. So by their ending, by the form, you know that they are all part of the same ghazal. But each couplet, each sher will have a separate independent meaning. Two shares, two couplets can also contradict each other. There is absolutely no problem in it because each one is independent of the rest. They are together only by virtue of following a similar rhyming structure, rhyming scheme. Now, this peculiarity of the ghazal form, this very atypicalness of the ghazal form had some serious implications. One, large stories cannot be told in a ghazal, in a sher. How do you tell a complete story with a beginning and an end within two lines? It's not possible. Larger themes are, ghazal is unfit for larger themes. A sher couplet is unfit for larger themes. This form is also unfit, unsuitable for a certain type of narrative. If there is a narrative to tell, then obviously you don't write a sher, you don't write a ghazal because it's not possible. Yet another implication is that it has to be repetitive. All ghazals, all shers were very, very repetitive. They quite often repeated, each one repeated someone else. The parameters of this ghazal tradition, of this ghazal genre, had all been fixed fairly early, in the early 18th century. And for any new Urdu poet who was living in the 18th or the 19th century, the challenge was not to say something new, but to repeat the old and yet to impart a new spin, give it a new twist, say the same thing in a new way, create some novelty within the same finite meaning. Turn the existing meaning upside down, do something to it, but otherwise there is a fairly finite set of meanings which have been fixed, which have been set. You generally don't go outside it, but within that you try and create a kind of a novelty. You know, it was something like, so Ghalib often did to Mir. They were separated by a generation, 19th and 18th century. Ghalib was a 19th century peak of Urdu poetry. Mir was an 18th century peak. Ghalib was a 19th century peak. Ghalib often did to Mir what Marx had done to Hegel. That is to reconfigure the elements within the same frame, rework the architecture, make top the bottom, make bottom the top, change the system, but within the same set of meanings. The basic art will not change. Basic thing will not change. So this was how Urdu proceeded since the 18th to the 19th. Ghazal. This was how Ghazal proceeded since the 18th to the 19th to the 20th century. What I'm trying to impress upon you is that we have here a most unusual poetry tradition. Ghazal particularly. Urdu in general, but Ghazal in particular. Urdu as a poetry tradition, it is unusual because One, it was internally connected in time. These are some of the features of Urdu. 18th century was connected with 19th century. People refer to each other. People refer to themes across time. It's all very familiar. It's all like a pack of cards. What a new poet does is that he has the same pack of cards. He shuffles and produces a different combination. So each poet, basically the entire mainstream Urdu literary tradition is like a pack of cards. It is finite. What changes, the newness is the different combinations, the shuffling of the card, picking up the cards, combining the cards. I think that would be a good imagery. So otherwise completely internally connected in time. Urdu was morally and socially completely neutral. This was the other important feature. It was not meant to inspire you. If you're looking for inspiration, then Urdu, mainstream Urdu is the last place you should go to. If you are looking for literature which is supposed to push you towards higher conduct, higher ideals, then Urdu is not where you go. Good poetry was judged on an aesthetic scale, not on a social or an ideological scale. So the 20th century assertions of people like Premchand and the others that literature is supposed to lead the society, Sahitya Samaj ka Deepak hai, this would have horrified, this would have shocked and offended our 18th and 19th century poets. This would sound completely alien to them. They were not interested in all that. It was self-referential. So it was connected in time. It was morally and socially completely neutral. It was self-referential. It constantly referred to itself, earlier times, but itself. Times were all flattened out. 18th and 19th century, 2 centuries were flattened out into a seamless kind of a time, and it referred to itself. So it was self-referential. There were no real characters in this. How do you develop characters when each two-liner is supposed to be independent? There were no real characters, but rather cardboard characters. The characters who appear in mainstream Urdu poetry, they are cardboard characters. Rind, Saqi, Pir Mugha, Qasid, Namabar, Ashik, Mashuk, Taqib. You have them all. They keep reappearing. They come again and again with fixed motives and ideas. There is no enough time or place to attribute new motives to them. So the poets are not even going to introduce these characters. They would use the word Qasid or Namabar, and they would expect the readers to know what is meant by it. Everybody knows what Qasid is supposed to do, what Pir Mugha is supposed to do, what Namabar is supposed to do. So all that you don't explain to them. You just use the word. In any case, where is the place? Where is the time? Do it. This poetry, so it had cardboard characters. It was not secular, but it was very heretical. Secular may not be a correct word, but heretical certainly on the religious question, on the question of faith, on the question of devotion. It was allergic to any form of moralizing. Any form, source, or agency of moralizing was just looked down upon, and therefore religion too was looked down upon. All the religious characters are villains in this tradition. So Sheikh, Zahid, Naseh, wise, the preacher, the faithful, the one who converts, talks about the correct conduct, they are all villains. They are laughed at, they are made fun of, they are ridiculed all the time. They are frankly either the comedians or the villains of mainstream Urdu poetry. All these respectable people, Sheikh, Nasir. So anything which even smacks of some kind of an exaltation is just looked down upon. It's ridiculed in this tradition. So that is Urdu for you. Not all of Urdu, but let's say mainstream Urdu poetry of 18th, 19th century, and also to some extent 20th century. I have just described the tradition to you with its major features. I would like to believe that it was very unusual, very atypical. It was a very, for its followers, for the lovers of Urdu, it was a very enchanting world, but actually a very disenchanted world. If you see what I mean, if you go by how I've described it, it's very disenchanted. So internally completely disenchanted, but a very enchanting world. An enchanting, disenchanted world, very insular in time, space, And theme, socially and morally completely neutral, not something that can possibly enter into textbooks for school children. And sure enough, it wasn't, but there is no way in which it could. It was like a circle that was closed and complete. So the circle people moved within the circle, but it was a circle of mainstream Urdu poetry. It was a circle closed and complete. You could not break out of it. You could not break the circle. The big question is, how did patriotism and nationalism make an intro into this world? How did patriotism enter this world that I have just described to you? How did they encroach into this world? How did the pressures of nationalism and patriotism encroach into this world? Or how did nationalist patriotic poetry breach this closed circle of mainstream Urdu? Prima facie, it appears very unlikely. It doesn't seem that it can happen, but it did happen. It happened in a very big way. And this is what I will demonstrate. This is the big question. This is the riddle. This is what my story is a part of. So the question is that I've just described a certain world to you, literary world, literary universe. It was like a closed and a complete circle. It seemed most unlikely to produce from within a patriotic nationalist poetry, but it did. How did that happen? That is the second part of my talk, which starts now. Here is my answer. Modernity, beginning of print, a proto-public sphere, all these happened in, let's say, in the second half of the 19th century. All these they kind of altered and reconfigured the world of Urdu, as indeed they reconfigured the world of other languages and literatures, but I am talking mainly about Urdu. Modernity and print did dreadful things to Urdu. It would be considered dreadful from the vantage point of a secure, insular, exclusive, patronage-based world of Urdu. So to them, it would all seem very, very dreadful that there is print and more people are reading and Urdu is reaching out to more people and so on. But it did happen. As a result of these developments, multiple transitions were triggered. So the second half of the 19th century triggered a large number of transitions, changes, or maybe mutations. What were these transitions and mutations? Of course, a very small, exclusive world of mushaira began to open up to a larger world of print. The world of print was small in the 19th century, yet much, much larger than the small, exclusive world of mushaira. So there is a kind of a opening out, or entry of more people into this exclusive world of Urdu. It still is very exclusive, but yet it opens out. It begins to break out. There is a shift from poetry to prose. There is a kind of journalism that begins. There is a shift from focus on from form to content. In the mainstream Urdu, content was really secondary. It was not so important. Important thing was form. It did not matter what you said. Quite often people said the same thing, but what mattered was how you said it. How Ghalib said the same thing, which was different from someone else, Zauq. So form was important, but suddenly now content also becomes important. You have to say new things. You can't just go on saying old things. Also, there was a shift from a very ornate, heavy Persianized style to a more direct, explicit, and a simple style. Many of these transitions were uncertain, tentative, incomplete. So I'm not saying that there was a total rehaul, total transformation from one to the other, but the transition was initiated in some ways. So it started. Some transitions remained incomplete. Yet another important transition from my story was that the new poets who made their entry into this world of Urdu, they were no longer dependent on patronage system. They had to work and fend for themselves. So they were out there. They were not insular. They were not product of patronage system. They were not dependent on patronage. They did not expect a patronage. The earlier patronage, in any case, died out. So Iqbal was a lawyer and a professor. Akbar Allahabadi was a session judge, worked for the British. Hali Panipati, Altaf Hussain Hali, three very important actors in my story. He actually worked in a bookstore. So they all had to fend for themselves. They were out there in the real social world, looking around. Now, in my story today, so this was the kind of a transition, big transition that happened, which may have been triggered by print or modernity or whatever. But it was a very real transition began to happen. In my story today, Hali is perhaps the most important character. He is the hero of the story. Hali Panipati, he's considered the first modernist from within Urdu, an extremely important person. From 1874, he started doing very, very unusual things which would be considered very unusual in his little world of Urdu. He wrote a long poem called Munajat-e Beva, the prayers of a widow. And it's a very tragic story of the sad life of a widow, nobody to look after her. So she's talking about her own life. This was very unusual. He did more unusual things. He organized a mushaira in Lahore, which was around a single theme of Barkha Rut. Now, organizing a mushaira is all right, but organizing a mushaira on one definite, explicit theme is unusual. And there also the theme was rainy season. This was very unusual. But much more than all this, he did even other unusual things. These things had not happened to the world of Urdu before. He wrote a long poem, Hubbe Watan, very long poem. I do not have it with me here. It simply means love of the country. Hub is an Arabic word, which, the words like Habib, Mehboob, Muhabbat, this is a root word for all of them. Hubbe Watan simply means love for the country. Now, the important thing is that his Hubbe Watan was not patriotic poetry, if you read it. It was a poetry on patriotism, on the importance of patriotism. It was a kind of sociology of patriotism. So it just talks about how important homeland becomes to those people who have to leave it. And he gives many examples of this. One example is of Bhagwan Ram. He said, he wrote, Bhagwan Ram was very comfortable in Ayodhya. He never missed his Ayodhya. He took his Ayodhya for granted. But when he was exiled and when he went to the jungle, it was then that he recognized the importance of his Vatan, of his homeland, of his Ayodhya. So people who are being displaced, who are going elsewhere, they develop a great yearning for their Vatan. So Hubbe Watan is a very interesting poem for this simple reason that it's not a patriotic poetry, but it's a kind of sociology of patriotism. It's a commentary on patriotism. This really opens the floodgates, I would like to believe. I would like to believe that Hali opened up the big circle, the closed and complete circle of Urdu in two important directions. Other directions also, but as far as patriotism is concerned. Firstly, he created the opening for a territorial homeland kind of patriotism, Hubbe Watani, because that is what his poem had indicated. It had hinted at that. But also a kind of religious patriotism, Islamic patriotism particularly. A love for one's religion, love for one's religious community, wherever your fellow religious people are. He also wrote, Hali, Maddo Jazre Islam, Ebb and Flow of Islam. It's a book written in Urdu, a very long poem. It's on the decline of Islam, the travails of Islam, the crisis of Islam. Because it was written at in each unit was of 6-liner, Musaddas, it came to be known as Musaddas. So it became Musaddas. That became very popular. So on the one hand, he created an opening for a territorial homeland patriotism. On another hand, he created an opening for an Islamic religious patriotism also. This is the time when this is the time of it's the time of the decline of high Islam. India is also one of the lands. Shibli Nomani, one important poet, he wrote a very moving poetry along the lines which had probably been inspired by Hali, but it's an independent poetry on the decline, of us Muslims, but Muslims all over. It is a very pan-Islamic poet. Let me just recite it to you. Marrakesh ja chuka. Marrakesh is Morocco. Marrakesh ja chuka, Faras gaya. Faras is Persia. Marrakesh ja chuka, Faras gaya. अब देखना ये है कि जी पाता है तुर्की का मरीज़े नीम जहां कब तक. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. How long is this sick man of Europe going to live? When will it die? It cannot live for very long. मराकश जा चुका फारस गया अब देखना ये है कि जी पाता है तुर्की का मरीज़े नीम जा कब तक. कोई समझाए ऐ तहजीब इंसानी के उस्तादों. Now this तहजीब इंसानी is an appeal to Europeans. तहजीब इंसानी के उस्तादों, ये जंग आराइयां ताक़े ये हशरंगेजियां कब तक. How long are you going to do this mayhem, this violence, this destruction, this cruelty? ये जंग कोई समझाए ऐ तहजीब इंसानी के उस्तादों, ये जंग आराइयां तब तब ताक़े हशरंगेजियां कब तक. कहां तक लोगे हमसे इंतकाम फतेह अयूबी. How long will you take the revenge for what happened in the Crusades 8 centuries ago, 9th century? Intiqam Fateh Ayyubi, the Crusades, 12th, 13th century. दिखाओगे हमें जंगे सलीबी का समा कब तक. How long are you going to make us suffer? Jange Salibi, the jang of the cross. Now this is a really wailing, it's about a loss, it's about a decline, but it's really a pan-Islamic poetry in a very classic kind of a sense. So this was one example. The other example of both Islamic patriotism, but also territorial homeland patriotism was, of course, Iqbal's Tarana-e-Hind. I'm giving it a new spin. I'm saying that there is an Islamic dimension to it. This poem, of course, became very famous. There is one line which did not become quite so famous, but that one line is very significant for me. Ganga, it's an appeal to Ganga. Wo din hai yaad tujhko, utra tere kinare jab karwan hamara. Now, I would like to believe that hum here refers to Muslims. Now, this combination may seem very unusual and may seem completely anachronistic today, but in the 19th century, there was a particular imagination of India as an Islamic heartland. This was, I would call this the Al-Hind imagination of India. This Al-Hind imagination of India, of course, ran into very serious trouble in the 20th century, in the times of mass politics, democracy, and so on. But in the 19th century, it was really nurtured. And I think many people nurtured it. Iqbal was one of them. And in his Tarana-e-Hind, I would like to look upon his Tarana-e-Hind as a combination of the two, of the territorial patriotism, but also a kind of a religious patriotism, and a combination of the two to an imagination of India as an Al-Hind. These are the kind of dilemmas that people lived through, Iqbal and Shibli Nomani. But one poet who belonged to the same times, the late 19th and the early 20th century, he escaped all these dilemmas or resolved all these dilemmas, between the Islamic religious and the patriotic. And he, for me, the second hero of my story today is that poet, Akbar Allahabadi. He lived from 1846. He died in 1922. He is an extremely important and most unusual poet. Why was he unusual? Akbar Allahabadi was a traditionalist. He celebrated tradition. He was conservative. He was all in favor of conserving things. He was a traditionalist. He was conservative. He was in government service. That's very important. He was a very, very religious person. And yet, I think he produced the finest or the highest brand of Indian nationalism through his poetry. His great commitment to Islam and to religion did not really take him to pan-Islamism, as it had taken Shibli and Iqbal, but strangely, it took him straight to Indian nationalism. And now, for the first time in my lecture, I am using the word Indian nationalism in all its dimensions. So Indian nationalism in all its dimensions can be found really in the poetry of Akbar. Akbar's poetry included almost all the elements that constituted Indian nationalism. It was anti-British and anti-imperialist, as both said, anti-imperialism was a very important element in Indian nationalism. Akbar's poetry had that. Akbar's poetry focused on syncretism, national unity, particularly Hindu-Muslim unity. You see, Muslims were about a minority of 25%. It was a huge minority. And therefore, Hindu-Muslim unity was considered virtually the linchpin of national unity. All the big nationalist leaders talked about it, and so did Akbar. Mind you, Akbar was not secular. Again, I would not use the word secular for Akbar. There was nothing secular about him. He was very critical of Christianity, but Hindu-Muslim unity was different. That was very special, and that he wrote a lot about. So he was so in that sense, he fulfilled those preconditions of Indian nationalism. He was anti-West. He was anti-Europe. He was against European domination of the world in general. But he was no supporter of pan-Islamism, unlike Iqbal. So he shared this anti-West thing with Iqbal, but broke away from Iqbal by not going over to pan-Islamism, but going to Indian nationalism. And the biggest thing, he was anti-imperialist, he was anti-British, he was syncretic, he stood up for national unity in his poetry, he was anti-West, and he was a great admirer of Gandhi. He actually wrote a big book collection of poetry, Gandhi Nama. He was older to Gandhi by about one generation, but referred to Gandhi with great respect. He referred to Gandhi as a representative of the East as against the onslaught of the West. And now I begin some of my most important examples of patriotism and nationalism in Urdu poetry, the very theme of the seminar today. He wrote, "Bujhi jati thi shamma mashriqi maghrib ki andhi se." The lamp of the East was about to be extinguished by this great storm from the West, from Europe. "Bujhi jati thi shamma mashriqi maghrib ki andhi se, umide roshni qayam hai lekin bhai Gandhi se." So long as Gandhi is there, Bhai Gandhi is there, there is an umide roshni, there is hope, there is optimism. He ridiculed the pan-Islamists. "Sheikh ji, tumko Mubarak room ho rahe." Oh Sheikh ji, good luck to you with your Iran and Constantinople. "Sheikh ji, tumko Mubarak room ho rahe." Hum to kehte hain ki Gandhi ji ki jai. For me, my template is here, right here, Gandhi. During the course of the Khilafat movement, there was a Hijrat movement organized. Many leaders of the Khilafat movement felt that India had become an un-Islamic land of the enemy, Darul Harb, and therefore in mass they should migrate to Afghanistan or wherever. Now Akbar really ridiculed this, and he said, "Hind se aapko hijrat ho Mubarak Hazrat, hum to Ganga hi pe maar ke aasan baithe." I have established myself on the Ganga, and therefore this is my place. He ridiculed them at a time when the Hijrat movement was actually going on. On how pan-Islamism derived its vibrance and vibrancy from its Indian connection, how Indian connection was extremely important for pan-Islamism, particularly during the course of the Khilafat movement. He wrote a beautiful four-liner, which is an address to Abe Jamjam, in other words, pan-Islamism. And he's saying, he's asking Abe Jamjam, why did you come and meet with Ganga? Abe Zamzam se kaha maine, mila Ganga se kyun? Kyun tari teenat mein itni natawani aa gayi? Why did you become so weak, so vulnerable, so as to come and meet up with Ganga? Abe Zamzam se kaha maine, mila Ganga se kyun? Kyun teri teenat mein itni natawani aa gayi? वो लगा कहने कि हजरत आप देखें तो जरा बंद शीशी में था, अब मुझ में रवानी आ गई. I was just locked up in a small bottle, and it's now that all the vibrance, all the flow, all the new things have started happening to me. This is a very small sum of the kind of poetry that he wrote. I want to recite a very longish poem by Akbar. It is important for 3 or 4 reasons. It is important for its anti-imperialism. He wrote it slightly before his death. By that time, he had retired from the government service. It is important for a critique of modernity and its centralizing and homogenizing tendencies. And it can also pass off as a really postmodernist critique of modernity. It is a traditional critique of modernity of its centralization. But then if Bodh is looking for 21st century elements, then there is that element also there. It's a longish poem, but I would like to recite it because it's also because my favorite. It's on the British modern state, modern government, and how they control and monopolize everything. सवारी उनकी है, उनकी सड़क है और डाक उनकी. I think I'm missing my words a little bit. सवारी उनकी है, उनकी सड़क है और डाक उनकी, उन्हीं की फौज है, उनकी पुलिस है और चाक उनकी, हवा में एयरशिप उनके, समंदर में जहाज उनके, अमल हम में किया करते हैं नामालूम राज उनके, परेस उनकी ज़बां उनकी, उलूम उनके, लुगात उनके. प्रेस, नॉलेज, लिटरेचर, वर्ड्स. परेस उनकी, ज़बां उनकी, उलूम उनके, इल्म, लुगात उनके, हमारी जिंदगी के सारे अज्जा पर है हाथ उनके. एवरी डायमेंशन ऑफ आवर लाइव्स आर इन देयर कंट्रोल. बहुत ऐसे हैं जो तरके ताउन के भी कायल हैं. सम पीपल वांट टू डिस्कनेक्ट, वांट टू ब्रेक द कनेक्शन. बहुत ऐसे हैं जो तरके ताउन के भी कायल हैं, मगर ऊंचे हैं जो अक्सर तरफ इंग्लिश की माइल हैं. द हाई एंड माइटी आर इंक्लाइंड टुवर्ड्स द ब्रिटिश. बहुत ऐसे हैं जो तरके ताउन के भी कायल हैं, मगर ऊंचे हैं जो अक्सर तरफ इंग्लिश की माइल हैं. फकत जिद है, इट्स माई इंसिस्टेंस, माई ऑब्स्टिनेसी. फकत जिद है जो कहती है कि जब अपनी ज़बां खोलो, हमारे पेशवाए हिंद गांधी जी की जय बोलो. This is his summary, this is his conclusion. फकत जिद है जो कहती है कि जब अपनी ज़बां खोलो, हमारे पेशवाए हिंद गांधी जी की जय बोलो. आइन कह रहे हैं आ रहा है दौर फितनों का. An era of and storm is brewing up, an era of restlessness is generating. कराइन कह रहे हैं आ रहा है दौर फितनों का, चलेंगी वो हवाएं, नक्श मिट जाएगा कितनों का. All these elites, all these people, they are just going to be swept aside by a new storm that is brewing up. Akbar is so important, and there is so much more to him that I think Yogesh should organize a separate session of partly recitation, partly a classification of Akbar's poetry into different sections. After Akbar, I think there was also a very, very theme-based patriotic poetry on specific issues, on specific themes. There was a 20th century Urdu poet, Bast, who wrote on Tilak, who wrote on other leaders, but his best poem was on home rule. And the template, the first line is, तलब फजूल है कांटों की फूल के बदले, नले बहिश्त भी हम home rule के बदले. Even paradise is not to be traded off. Home rule is so important. These are the kind of lines along which Urdu poetry began to flow in the late 19th and the 20th century. And in the 30s, with the beginning of the progressive movement, a new strand developed, which was all about the limits of nationalism. So limits were also being pointed out, but it was also a part of within a certain nationalist framework. A nationalist critique of nationalism. This had begun happening politically. Tagore had done it, Gandhi had done it, Nehru had done it, Premchand had done it, but it also started happening through Urdu poetry. And its signature poetry, of course, is Faiz's Subh Azadi, in which he talks about the independence after 47, and he says, "Ye daag daag ujala, ye shab gazida seher." वो इंतजार था जिसका, ये वो सहर तो नहीं, ये वो सहर तो नहीं कि जिसकी आरज़ू लेकर चले थे यार कि मिल जाएगी. It just goes on and on. The last three lines are, अभी गरानी ये शब में कमी नहीं आई. The night is still very dark. निजाते दीदाओ दिल की घड़ी नहीं आई. That sight which will give us delight, joy, that has not come. अभी गरानी ये शब में कमी नहीं आई, निजाते दीदाओ दिल की घड़ी नहीं आई, चले चलो कि वो मंजिल अभी नहीं आई. So it's an incomplete independence. Larger world has to wait for us, and we have to keep fighting for it. This also is well within the framework of nationalism because it simply points out the limits of nationalism. So a new strand that was added in the 30s was that the limits of nationalism, after its highlighting its dimensions, its features, its constituent elements, limits of this nationalism also began to be talked about by the progressives. So basically, to sum up, all that I have said is, Urdu was a most unusual and atypical tradition. It broke out of its closed and complete circle in the context of the second half of the 19th century. Hali, the first Urdu modernist, he created two very different openings, but they were also connected, of religious patriotism and a territorial patriotism. Akbar Allahabadi elevated it to full-fledged Indian nationalism, which included all its constituent themes: anti-imperialism, Hindu-Muslim unity, syncretism, Gandhi, opposition to imperialism, European imperialism. All these elements were there in Akbar's poetry. Chakbast focused on specific episodes, specific themes of the nationalist struggle, and the progressives highlighted the limits of nationalism. The old circle, the closed and complete, the circle that was closed and complete, that had by now transformed into a flowing stream with the joining of new themes, new strands, new energies, new kinds of ideas, and that became a flowing stream. After 1947, if you look at the Bombay cinema, that is not the theme for today, then you see a great full flowering of these kinds of strands when patriotism, of course, was an important theme of Bombay cinema in the 50s and 60s. And on the one hand, poets from the Hindi tradition, Kavi Pradeep and Bharat Bhushan, they gave their inputs, but so did Sahir and Kaifi Azmi and the others. But that had a long tradition behind it, which is what I have talked about. So I think I will stop now. I think I've not taken too much of time. So I basically have a story. I had a riddle. I had a question, and I tried to provide the answer to that question. If there are questions and comments from the audience, I would be. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Salil. That was a fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed it because it actually traced a certain period in Urdu poetry, late 19th and early 20th century, about which not many of us are very familiar, and particularly the work of Akbar Allahabadi, as you pointed out. I mean, personally, for me, I think what was even more interesting than Akbar Allahabadi, I mean, I've heard about him from you and I've read some bit of Akbar, but what fascinated me and what interests me, and I wish you could say a little more about this, was how people like Hali were able to resolve these two impulses, what you're calling a pan-Islamism on the one hand, and a certain kind of patriotism or love for the homeland or Al-Hind on the other. Because to me, it seems that the developments after partition, if you look at of course the progressive movement in Urdu poetry and Urdu literature was very, very powerful, and it continued to exercise its influence and its dominance many years till after 47 also. And yet if you look at a certain strand of poetry, it sort of kind of begins to deviate from this overarching vision of a composite nationalism towards a more insular kind of thing, particularly when people talk about the Hijrat and the construction of certainly in Pakistan, a certain construction of a Pakistani nationalism, which I think is understandable in its own way. But I think there are lessons to be learned from how these two strands were brought together and resolved in this, what seems to be completely kind of irreconcilable at a certain stage later. So I wish, I mean, we could have some more about this particular aspect of your talk. Though, of course, what you have quoted from Akbar Allahabadi, absolutely amazing. Because he's not, of course, now he's recognized, but, a lot of the fame of Urdu poetry, particularly in the 20th century, it has been sort of appropriated by the progressives, at a certain level. So there are these earlier poets, of course, a little earlier than him. Either it is Ghalib or it is Iqbal, and then you move on to the progressives. So I'm glad you've sort of highlighted the works of a person like Akbar Allahabadi. Much underrated, but I think very significant. And I agree with you, and I would request Yogesh that maybe we should have a session on Akbar Allahabadi and any other poet who would fit into this kind of a category, right? Uh, so. Uh, uh, and I think it's a very informative lecture. It's also a fascinating lecture, and I would like the audience, if there are any questions or comments which Salil would like to address now, please go ahead.
Niyati
Yes,
Gangwar.
yes,
Yes,
please.
good afternoon, sir. Thank you very much for the very engaging lecture. What I wanted to know was that how do we exactly negotiate with the disjuncture between Akbar Allahabadi's nationalist poetry, where he is, of course, criticizing modernity and Western education, and his personal life, because we know he was employed with the colonial state. He also got a pension from the state, and he also sent his son abroad for education. So, how do you, because I've written my MPhil dissertation on him, so as far as I was concerned, I try to see it as the way he's using satire. He's using satire in a way to kind of vent out this disjuncture. So I wanted your thoughts on it, sir.
Sure, sure. Uh, uh, how do you want it, Yogesh? Both? Do I take them up one by one, or?
I think since they've just begun the question, maybe you can answer this one, and then if there are more, we
Okay,
can
so
club them together.
I'll answer both the questions, the Bodh's question and Niyati's question. Both, it is definitely a tension, and there are 2 or 3 ways out. In literature, I think people also live with a certain tension without resolving it. Hali lived with it all his life. He experienced this tension. It's there in his Hubbe Watan, but he lives with it. He does not resolve it. Iqbal actually makes a transition, complete transition. So people say that 1908 is a great break, epistemological break in Iqbal, and that's the period of a transition from Indian nationalism to a kind of pan-Islamism. He also starts writing in poetry because his audience changes. Now he's writing for a larger Islamic audience outside India also. So he clearly makes the transition and from Tarana Hind to a Tarana Milli. So Sare Jahan Se Acha, and the transition is to Muslim Hum Watan Hai Sara Jahan Hamara. It is Akbar who really resolves it. And Akbar is able to resolve it by looking upon Gandhi as the representative of the East. Because the big question for Akbar is East versus West. This was also the big question for Iqbal. But for that, the resolution of that question took him to pan-Islamism, and Akbar really resolves it completely and unambiguously with Indian nationalism. So I think this is a big tension, and the 3 ways out are: some people live with the tension, some make the transition, and some, like Akbar, they resolve it. So this is how I would like to look at this problematic. Niyati, I think some of his early poetry is more a critique of modernity, modern technology, modern science, science versus God, his critique of philosophy, etc., which is subversive in some ways, but not all that subversive. Right. Much of his subversive poetry was written during the period of the Khilafat movement. He had retired by then, and that was a different context altogether. His early poetry is very interesting sociologically. I mean, that is what I would like us to discuss maybe at a later stage, when he critiques modern technology, print, camera, he supports calligraphy, all that he does, modern philosophy, modern knowledge, English language. But that, I suppose, is less subversive, though very, very interesting for us. But his very direct and explicit anti-British poetry, a lot of it is written in the context of the Khilafat movement and just before his death.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Salil, there is a question in the chat box.
Yeah.
I'll just read it out.
Yeah.
It says, one second. How did Urdu transform in cinema from something like K. Asif's Mughal-e-Azam with highbrow poetic dialogues to M.S. Satyu's Garam Hawa, which had some of the more localized Urdu and realistic version of what one would hear in daily life, and to the now caricature like.
I don't think it was a transition. These were parallel strands which remained. Mughal-e-Azam, of course, is a high point of one kind of Urdu. It's a historical fiction. So K. Asif tried to capture a particular time. And I don't think Mughal-e-Azam created a tradition. There were not many films subsequently of this kind with that kind of a language. So I would not see a transition, but I would say these are parallel traditions. Garam Hawa, of course, is more representative in the songs, in the dialogues since the 50s and the 60s. And that remained fairly dominant till the 70s also. In 80s, of course, things began to change. So yes, Urdu played a very important role in Bombay cinema at the level of lyrics, at the level of dialogues, at the level of providing imageries, etc. But that remained from the 50s. I don't think there was a transition. There were multiple strands which ran parallelly. Mughal-e-Azam was more of a one-off thing. So I don't think it did not constitute and it could not possibly, but there were other parallel trends which continued. Garam Hawa was more a part of the trend. So I would not quite pose it in this manner, transition from Mughal-e-Azam to Garam Hawa. Mughal-e-Azam is atypical, unusual. Garam Hawa is a trend, and these trends were in operation since the 50s onwards.
But Salil, would you not agree that, hello?
Yes.
Yes. Would you not agree that, films that we used to call or still call so-called Muslim socials, they tended to stereotype the community through the use of a certain idiom, which was sometimes highbrow Urdu, sometimes a certain kind of Urdu which had more relevance to the language which was spoken. So it was part of a certain type stereotyping also.
Yeah, absolutely. At a time, Muslim socials really belonged in a big way to the 60s. And they also almost ended with the 60s, with Mehboob Ki Mehndi and one or two Mere Mehboob, because it was a completely artificial construction of a universe. Lucknow, Aligarh, Muslim, feudal, Nawab, Hukka, stake, and so on. And that needed the Urdu language because no other language could really convey a sense of that cultural universe. And so Urdu was employed. But Urdu was not, it generally was a part of the very resources of Bombay cinema. In Muslim social, of course, it came to be employed in a very, very big way because it had a role to play. It had to inform a particular cultural universe, but it remained, Urdu was generally there. Bombay Muslim social was a kind of a construction, a completely constructed universe, and you could not communicate a sense of that constructed universe except by highbrow Urdu. So highbrow Urdu had to be there.
So Karthik here has something to say. Karthik?
Yes.
Thank you, sir, for so much informative lecture. As we know that 1857 is the first time we saw a revolt or something against British in a large context, and there is a whole debate going around that it's the revolt of 1857 or the first war of the independence, and there are or the mutiny. But how we see Ghalib's as a modern and Ghalib's patriotism, because there is a share by Ghalib in which he says that he कुफ्र मुझे रोके है, इमाम मुझे रोके है, खींचे है मुझे कुफ्र, कलीसा मेरे आगे है, काबा मेरे पीछे. So in this he sees the changing transformation of the politics and everything. So how we can see that Ghalib's patriotism and everything?
There are some questions in that chat box. No, I would not quite, Karthik, I would not quite look at it this way. Ghalib very much belongs to the mainstream Urdu poetry, that big, closed, enchanting, but disenchanted circle, the world that I talked about. that very famous, much of his Diwan had been written before 1857. So I would also not like to use specific couplets from there to indicate a kind of a shift in political universes brought about by the 1857. Ghalib was very deeply affected by the mutiny. He wrote a book, he wrote his diary, Dastambu. He was at the receiving end of the mutiny, but I will not, there are important elements that you are pointing out. I would recognize all of them, but I would not put them all together in a cause-effect kind of a. So that would be my answer to the question.
So there is a question by Shrishti Khare. Can you briefly comment on how literary genres in Urdu other than poetry were articulating nationalism, patriotism, and anti-imperialist sentiment in the 20th century?
Yes, that is an important theme. Outside poetry, it was pretty much, Urdu journalism was running pretty much parallelly with Hindi. So I would not know very much about it, except, I would not be able to say very much about it, except to say that there is an important book brought out by Sahitya Akademi. It was edited by Gopi Chand Narang, which talked about Urdu journalism, Urdu poetry, Urdu prose, Urdu short story, and other things in the 20th century. And where there is some reflection, some talk about what kind of politics they represent. More than that, I would not be able to say, except that there was, of course, we know that there was no support. Urdu Pakistan movement, the Muslim League movement did not receive much of a literary support from the literary world of Urdu. There was not much support for it. But specific dimensions, veins and arteries of Urdu prose, Urdu journalism, Urdu poetry, that I would not be able to comment on because I would not be very confident of this. I have not done this very much, except in a very casual manner.
Muzaffar Dar has raised a hand. Muzaffar?
Hi, sir. Hi, sir. This is Muzaffar. I just want to say a couple of things, if you can, have some comments on that. Like, how do you see the idea of Muttahida Qawmiyat, composite nationalism, which was earlier propagated by Maulana Hussain Madani? Even he wrote a book, Islam and Muttahida Qawmiyat. Then it was forwarded by Maulana Azad. And there was a much debate between Iqbal and Maulana Hussain Madani on this, composed nationalism, where Iqbal was talking about, Islam can be compatible with nationalism only in that country, while Muslims will be in majority, like Iran, Iraq. And he was against this type of composed nationalism in country like India. So how do you see this, Iqbal and Hussain Madani's composite nationalism and Islamic nationalism?
Thank you. Muzaffar, thank you for that question. Yes, there was a very interesting correspondence between Iqbal and Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madni, in which Iqbal was going through this disenchanted phase. He was very disenchanted with territorial nationalism. And I think he was expressing those doubts. And Hussain Ahmad Madni, I thought with a great deal of sophistication, replied to Iqbal by saying that Millat, Ummah and Qawm, they might superficially resemble each other, but they have very different meanings. And the meaning that Hussain Ahmad Madni imparted was, he said, Millat is the generic name for any community. Any community can be called Millat. Ummah is a historically privileged special community of Muslims. So Muslims are the Ummah. But Qawm is a territorial idea, that composite nationalism. So Indian people are a Qawm. Any community can be a millat, and Muslims are the ummah. And he said, if you look at it this way, then there should obviously not be any inherent contradiction between these concepts. You need to separate them, look at them separately, and at the level of actual concrete politics, he put forward this alternative idea of Muttahida Qawmiyat, or alternative composite nationalism, which was in some ways his reply to Iqbal's concept of nationalism. Iqbal's intentions, I still say he did not, he made a transition, but he was not able to resolve these tensions. But then these tensions are not easily resolved. So Hussain Ahmad Madni, with a great deal of sophistication, replied to Iqbal in his debate.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Muzaffar.
There is one more person who had raised
Paritosh and
a
Abhinandan,
hand.
I can see. Paritosh Singh and
Yes,
Abhinandan Pandey.
yes. Please go ahead, Abhinandan.
Uh, oh, Thank you, sir, for a beautiful lecture. Uh, can I speak in Urdu?
Please go ahead.
Thank
Of
you.
course.
So, जो एक बढ़िया ही अजीब सा एक कश्मकश है, वो मौलाना अल्ताफ हुसैन हाली के कैरेक्टर में है, उनके किरदार में है। एक तरफ हुजूर जो है वो मुकदमा शेर व शायरी में गज़ल की शायरी को कमज़ोर या ख़राब बताते हुए नज़र आते हैं, और दूसरी तरफ यादगार गालिब में, गालिब जो कि गज़ल का शायर था, उसकी तारीफ में और उसके क्रिटिसिज्म में कसीदे गढ़ते हुए भी नज़र आते हैं, और उसको आखिरी क्लासिकी शायर का जो दर्जा मिलता है, या फिर गालिब के हवाले से जो और भी दीगर बातें, जो फिलोसॉफिकल कॉन्स्ट्रक्ट्स जो हैं गालिब के, जो अभी मकबूल हैं और फेमस हैं, वो सब यादगार गालिब की देन है हमारे यहाँ। इसके अलावा जो है मुकदमा शेर व शायरी में तो हुजूर ये भी कहते हैं कि मुसद्दस जो जॉनर है, इसी की इजाद के लिए खुदा ने मुझे यहाँ उतारा था ज़मीन पर, कि मैं मुसद्दस की इजाद कर सकूँ, इन्वेंट कर सकूँ और लोग इसमें बात कर सकें। और इसके तो ये जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है, एक तो मौलाना अल्ताफ हुसैन हाली का जो गज़ल की तरफ जो उनकी नफ़रत है, और वो है, और एक जो बड़ा-सा डिबेट वो शुरू करते हैं कि गज़ल जो है उसमें जितनी बातें कही जा सकती थी, उतनी बातें कही जा चुकी हैं और की गुंजाइश नहीं है, और गज़ल को ख़त्म कर देना चाहिए। तो इसको तो बाद में तरक्की पसंदों ने ही खारिज किया, उनके ही आइडिया को, जिसको कि उन्होंने गज़ल में जो समाजी पहलू डाला, और बाद में हल्का अरबाब ज़ौक़ के लोगों ने भी खारिज किया जब उन्होंने नफ्सियाती पहलू डाला इसमें। और दूसरी जो अहम बात है इसमें वो है कि जो ये कॉन्फ्लिक्ट कैरेक्टर है अल्ताफ हुसैन हाली का, वो पूरी उर्दू शायरी में एक, या हमारी जो अदब का जो पूरी तारीख है, उसमें एक बड़ा ही मिस्टीरियस इंसान की तरह नजर आता है। एक इस पे थोड़ी सी कमेंट्री, और दूसरी जो है, जो सवाल अभी थोड़ी देर पहले पूछा गया था कि बाकी जॉनर्स में पोएट्री के अलावा, तो उसके बारे में हम कुछ ये जोड़ना चाहेंगे कि 20th सेंचुरी से पहले उर्दू में बाकी जॉनर्स में, यानी शायरी के जितने असनाफ हैं, जितने जॉनर्स हैं, उनको अगर हम हटा दें तो उर्दू अदब में कोई खास काम नहीं हो रहा था। नस्र जो है, यानी प्रोज जो है, वो उर्दू अदब में 20th सेंचुरी की पैदाइश है, और इसके बाद ही नस्र में बड़ा काम होना शुरू हुआ है हमारे यहाँ, जो है जर्नलिज्म की शक्ल में हो या आगे दूसरी सूरतों में हो। खासतौर से फिक्शन की जो राइटिंग है वो 20th सेंचुरी से ही शुरू होती है। तो वहाँ पर जो है आगे का काम प्रेमचंद और बाकी तरक्की पसंदों ने संभाल लिया था। तो एक ये नस्र का हिस्सा, और दूसरा मौलाना अल्ताफ हुसैन हाली के इस कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग कैरेक्टर पर आपका तज़िया।
इसी यस, सेकंड तो ठीक है। हाली ही इज अवेयर ऑफ दिस टेंशन, ही इज अवेयर ऑफ दिस डिलेमा, ही इज अवेयर ऑफ दिस कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन, एंड ही डज रेफर टू इट इन हिज यादगार गालिब ओनली। वो लास्ट में ये, you see, it is easy to see his dilemma. He sees the limitations of ghazal as a medium. Ghazal, not, you cannot except repeating yourself, you cannot do very much. You know, Hali is a modernist. He wants new things to be done, new things to be said, and he knows that it's not possible to do it through ghazal. And yet he is very much a product of the same tradition. So he's trying to break out of a tradition which he is a part of. And in his biography of Ghalib, Yadgar Ghalib, he says कि वो देवी का मैं, I am now a victim of that blind faith. So for me, Ghalib is the ultimate, but I know that there are serious limitations of the kind of poetry that is produced in that climate. But there is no doubt that it was absolutely wonderful that poetry was able to transcend so many limits of human imagination, and they were able to elevate human imagination to a new level altogether. Yet you need to break out of it, and you need to move on and break new grounds. So I think superficially it's a dilemma which Hali was aware of, but obviously anyone living in those times is bound to go through these kinds of dilemmas, which he did. So that's it, Abhinandan.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Right. So there is a question in the chat box, Salil.
Yeah.
In today's time, how is Urdu poetry shaping and influencing the thinking of youth who have the passion for radical changes?
Probably not very much. Urdu belonged to a particular times, and I don't think it's Urdu has now also adapted to Hindustani, Hindi. It's proceeding along the same lines. So its high point, its high tide is obviously over. Its high tide was 19th century, and that literature is available with us, and people read it. Whether it inspires them or not is a different point. The inspiring capacity of Urdu itself is of a very, very different kind. So our modern expectations may be different, but Urdu also has reinvented itself. It has to reinvent itself further. That is true of all modern literary traditions. If they have to keep up with the times, then they have to undergo all kinds of changes, mutations, transformations, which Urdu is going on. Sometimes the transition is fast, sometimes it's not so fast, but it is set on a path of transition quite clearly.
Subsequent discussions, right?
Yes,
Ritu is just
absolutely.
appreciating her.
Yes, absolutely.
Appreciating your
If
lecture.
Yogesh is there, I think only he can organize it. I would be very happy. Yeah.
No, I just was very interested in hearing, and actually it requires a lot of discussion further because, you're talking about early 20th, you have to reflect on McDonald's movement, rise of modern Hindi, how it affects Urdu. And I would like to be very interested to, know how it affects the entire Urdu poetry, the subject and the content of the Urdu Shairi itself with the coming of this. And then also, I do not know, I may be completely wrong on this since I have not, I'm not, not seen Urdu so much. But is this that the these early shairs whom you're mentioning, these poets, also were about, you mentioned that some of them were against or were against the modern technologies, etc. So if you read Francis Robinson, he does talk about the impact of how the Islam was resistant to print initially, and it, sort of that whole thing about that, it was questioning the value, the traditions which existed in terms of oral transmission of knowledge and etc. So is it so that they were also, taking it forward, the similar kind of Islamic value traditions when they were, writing against the print or the technologies, modern technologies, etc. So I believe a lot of more discussion is required,
Sure.
but definitely a very beautiful presentation. Your shairi is, inshallah, extremely good. We need a session separate for your shairi.
Yes,
So
yes.
the oration is so good. So thank you all of you, and thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions, comments? Anybody?
Both, can I?
Yes, please. Yes,
Achha,
Yogesh.
I just have a small question from Salil, and that is vis-a-vis these poets whom he referred to, Nasir Akbarabadi and others. I was just wondering, is the universe of these poets and the expressions in which they are expressing their universe is just is it just drafted around the genre of Urdu poetry, or this is just one of the other genres in which they have an ability to express that universe? And if, say, for instance, I don't know, but I'm just asking this as a question, if Akbarabadi was writing in Hindi, say, for instance, would his poetic expression and the depth of his argument remain the same? Or, say, for instance, someone writing from Lahore, would he be writing in Punjabi also? Would the length and breadth of their universe be the same? And therefore, my question is is it the genre of the poetry which gives them the ability to express in the way they were, or it also transcends those limits of the genre?
Yogesh, a bit of both. You're saying that there is an internal world. No world, no literary world can really be very isolated, very exclusive, very insular. But some are more insular than some others. That is always possible. So the role of context can be a little bit more in vis-a-vis certain literary traditions and will probably be a little bit less in certain literary traditions. What I'm saying about our early Urdu poets, the mainstream Urdu poetry, that when I say it's socially insular, I am basically saying that the role of context, the time and space and the context was relatively less. It was very, very insular. It was just a bubble tradition. It was called a garden poetry. So garden does not grow on its own. It grows under extremely rules, disciplines. It's different from a jungle. So the imagery of a jungle and a garden is important. Jungle is much more responsive to climate, natural climate, people coming and going, the context, etc. So what you're saying is an important point generically, that all literary traditions must be responsive to their own times and to their own context. They have to be. This is generically true. But within that, there are variations. Not all traditions need to be equally responsive or equally insular. And Urdu that I'm talking about, particularly the early Urdu, the mainstream Urdu, the 18th and 19th century Urdu, it managed to retain a great deal of insularity. So it was remarkably cut off from the wider social themes, from the other themes. It did not. So it was able to achieve a fairly high level of insularity and neutrality from the context. So it was much more context, it was less context dependent and more context neutral compared to some of the other traditions. But as an absolute truth, obviously, no tradition can be fully neutral. To give you the answer from within the tradition, I think there are two answers. Ghalib wrote at one point, this was also a question for him. The question that you posed to me, Yogesh, Ghalib posed this question to himself. His question was, where do my ideas come from? And his answer was that my ideas come from the top, from above, not from the outside world, from above. So he said, आते हैं ग़ैब से ये मज़ामी ख़याल में, ग़ालिब सरीरे ख़ामा नवाए सरोश है. When these ideas come from the top, so the tip of my pen is the word of God. So God, नवाए सरोश. Mir, a century before Ghalib, said that मुझको शायर न कहो मीर की साहिब मैंने दर्दो गम जितने किए जमा तो दीवान किया. All that I write is essentially a compilation of all the pain and trauma that I see around myself. So at an abstract philosophical level, he said that he was compiling all the restlessness of the world and putting it into his poetry. Darhami bechani, darhami means bechani. Darhami hal ki hai sari mere diva mein. The restlessness of the world is reflected in my poetry. Tu bhi kar sair ye majmua parishani ka. You also come and visit this compendium of parishani. So this is what he wrote, but basically they achieved a great deal of insularity. That is my point, Yogesh.
Thank you, Salil.
If I may add to it, we find these tensions.
Sorry, Tanuja, you're not very clear. Just repeat yourself.
So within Riti traditions and the Dingle traditions, like which sort of exclusively dedicate themselves to romanticism and Dingle to heroic poetry, we find there are very few examples of otherwise, something happening otherwise. So Riti is predominantly dedicated to bhakti and to romantic writing, whereas Dingle is largely heroic poetry with, so there could be an example there too.
Yeah, sure.
So, Salil, there is another question in the chat box. Devanand Kamath. He would like to know that in the 20th century, print presses were being established in many parts, and regional languages were also emerging through this printing press. and using which the regional middle classes was trying to create a regional identity through language.
Sure.
So how did the rise of this regional language affect Urdu? And how did Urdu influence these regional languages?
Well, I think a dialogue across literary traditions did not wait for the arrival of print, Devanand. It speeded up. The arrival of print speeded up a kind of dialogue across literary traditions, regional, but it did not start with print. That is the first point. Because your question is virtually a theme of a seminar, and it would be very interesting to see the nature of the dialogue. The dialogue happened, it was speeded up with print. It continued in the 20th century. There was much greater dialogue between some traditions than some other traditions. So Bengali and Urdu, for instance, Bengali and Hindi, for instance, there is a much richer dialogue and mutual give and take. And so on. Hindi and Urdu there is, but Urdu does not have an equal same kind of a dialogue with all the other traditions for various reasons, maybe because of the script, because of its own past, because of the Persian heritage, because of the fact that it was so much a product of the Persian rich Persian literary tradition. Its dialogue with other regional traditions is relatively a little less. Hindi is able to reach out much more. Maybe that's because of the common Sanskrit base, or maybe because of the script, various other reasons. But there is a dialogue. Again, my answer is similar that my answer was to Yogesh. There is no absolute answer, but within this dialogue, certain traditions have a better, smooth dialogue, much more inter-borrowing than certain others. So it would be a mixed story.
Salil, if I may add something to what you have said.
Yeah.
If you look at the story of linguistic traditions before the 18th century in India, that is from the 13th century onwards, where you have the emergence of the modern Indian languages and their literary traditions, there is a very easy kind of give and take happening across traditions, largely oral, but even in the written forms. And sometimes they overlap to such an extent that it is very difficult to make out distinct linguistic traditions also. So, for instance, what we broadly call the Hindi linguistic and literary tradition could stretch over a very large part of, beginning with Delhi, UP, Rajasthan, and even parts of Gujarat. That is one. Secondly, print culture and the coming of colonial rule did necessitate a certain kind of categorization. Certainly, the print technology meant that scripts had to be standardized. Now, this was not always the case. Prior to the 18th century, even scripts were not standardized. Sindhi had something like 48 scripts in the middle of the 19th century. So then this requirement, as it were, of a language with a specific script also then meant that languages tended to get identified in a somewhat insular kind of way. So in fact, there is a certain distinctiveness about each literary tradition or linguistic literary tradition which begins to develop. Of course, the give and take, of course, the interaction and the dialogue between these literary traditions continues. But I think there is a kind of lessening of this when you move to the print tradition.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yogesh.
And part of the distinction that we make between Hindi and Urdu, after all, we do accept that there is one language with two scripts at least, and then how they sort of diverge into two distinct linguistic literary traditions is also part of the same story.
Sure. Boundary lines become distinct. That, of course, with Yogesh, you wanted to say something?
No, I rose the hand by mistake.
Okay.
So do we have any more questions?
So Devanand, you've got two answers
anything?
to your question, and slightly different
Sorry?
ones. And I'm telling Devanand that he's got two different answers. My answer was one, but your answer was that with the arrival of print, actually boundary lines become much sharper. So the nature of dialogue in the 20th century is inevitably different from the nature of dialogue that would have preceded, that would have happened in the earlier times. But that was a much more syncretic kind of dialogue. In the 20th century, the dialogue is different.
Yeah, I'm also relating it to the fact that earlier the dialogue was across oral traditions more than written traditions.
Sure.
Yeah. So I don't see any hands raised or any comments. So maybe we can bring this discussion and this wonderful lecture to a conclusion. But on behalf, sorry, there is a hand raised. Sorry. Devanand, have you raised your hand again?
सर दरअसल ये क्वेश्चन इसलिए था कि मैंने मैथिली लैंग्वेज पे काम किया है फिर में, तो उसमें जो पहली जो दो हिस्ट्री लिखी गई थी वो उर्दू लैंग्वेज पे ही थी, वो 1880 के दशक में लिखी गई थी। लेकिन जैसे हम 20वीं शताब्दी में एंटर करते हैं तो सारी हिंदी में, इंग्लिश में, मैथिली में लिखी जाती है, जबकि 1880 के दशक तक उर्दू को बड़ा प्रेस्टीज था, दरभंगा के दरबार में हो चाहे बिहार में हो। तो इसलिए ये क्वेश्चन मैंने इसलिए पूछा था क्योंकि 1905 में पहली मैगजीन उसकी मैथिली भाषा में निकल कर आई थी। तो मुझे ऐसा लग रहा था कि जैसे कि एक वो इमरजेंस जो हो रहा था नेशनलिज्म का, साथ में रीजनलिज्म का भी इमरजेंस हो रहा था, जिसपे एक बाउंड्री मुझे ऐसा लगा था कि क्रिएट हो रही थी। मतलब मुझे इससे मैथिली लैंग्वेज के संदर्भ में मुझे ऐसा लगा कि एक बाउंड्री भी क्रिएट हो रही थी, इसलिए क्वेश्चन मैंने पूछा।
श्योर, बिल्कुल, एब्सोल्युटली।
थैंक यू सर।
थैंक यू।
Right. So I will just briefly sort of take this opportunity to thank Salil for as I said, giving us wonderful insight into this poet and to this particular issue of nationalism and patriotism. On behalf of SUS, also I would like to thank the history faculty and particularly Yogesh for organizing this series and ensuring that this series gets off to a wonderful start with this lecture. I think Yogesh needs to be congratulated for this. And so thank you all very much for your coming for this lecture and participating in it. And thank you, Salil. Thank you, Yogesh, and everybody from the history faculty. Thank you.
Thank you both. I would like to invite Abhinav here for, on behalf of the History Society to end the session and to thank everybody. Yeah. Abhinav, are you there?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Yes, Abhinav.
Yeah. So, I would like to thank our honorable speaker, Professor Salil sir, for being humble to accept our invitation, our respectable moderator, Professor Bodh sir, our program coordinators, Professor Tanuja ma'am, and Professor Yogesh sir, to make this lecture happen, and all scholars and students present here. Thank you, sir, for this fascinating talk. We learned much about the perspectives on Urdu and this relation with the nationalism and patriotism. I hope all of you enjoyed the lecture and will take away some good thoughts from it. Thank you, sir, on behalf of the History Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you.